This headstone belongs to Seth Miner. Ever heard of him? It's okay if you haven't. I don't think he minds. He wasn't rich or famous or known for anything significant, really. He was just a poor hop farmer in my favorite place, my hometown of North Brookfield, New York. And Seth and his wife had 12 mouths to feed. He was a very religious man, a deacon in the Baptist church, and Seth Miner had some very firm beliefs. One of them was that women did not deserve more than a basic education. They were just going to be wives and mothers anyway. The school's resources were better spent on the boys. As both an educated and woman, you can imagine how I feel about Seth Miner's beliefs. And it goes something like this. Ugh. However, baby number 5 of his 12 born in 1815 would give Daddy a run for his money as far as that silly little belief was concerned. They named her Myrtilla, and Myrtilla wanted to change the world. She loved to learn, read every book she could get her hands on, but she was also born with a spinal infection and then contracted tuberculosis. They didn't think she was going to make it, but she was a tough little cookie, and she did. They lived on Mill Hill Road, which in those days wasn't so much a road, but a very steep trail, and getting to school every morning for her classes, going home for lunch, back for her afternoon classes, and then home for chores was quite the feat. But she didn't complain about the bumps and bruises to her head and body when she often fell. Only when she was too ill to go to school would she be upset. She somehow convinced her father, Seth, to let her go through all 6 grades offered at the schoolhouse. And at the age of 15, women in the early 1800s really only had 2 choices. You could be a wife and a mother, or you could be a teacher. Myrtilla wholeheartedly chose option number 2. She had several teaching positions across New York State. She was an amazing teacher, but eventually she ended up living and teaching in Vermont. One day, after a long day of classes, she received a letter from a Southern gentleman whose job it was to recruit teachers. He said there was no one else he had his heart set on more than getting Myrtilla, and would she please come teach the daughters of plantation owners in Mississippi. Still very much wanting to change the world, Myrtilla said yes almost instantly. A decision that would not only change the course of her life, but that of millions of others. She had been exposed to slavery in the North, of course. I think people forget we had slavery, but it was nothing compared to what she would see in the South. To say she was horrified and disgusted is a massive understatement. She actually became friends with one of the plantation owners and said, "You hate slavery, so why do you have slaves?" He said, "If I have to pay for labor and other plantations don't, I'll lose everything. But I try to treat them as best I can." Myrtilla simply said, "That's not good enough. The least you could do is let me teach their children." He explained that teaching slaves to read and write was illegal and she would be locked up instantly. Annoyed but not defeated, Myrtilla, who wasn't feeling the greatest anyway, decided to head back to North Brookfield after only 2 years in Mississippi. That's when she decided to open the Normal School for Colored Girls in Washington, D.C. Her dream was that her students would then go on to open their own schools across the country for all children, no matter their skin color. It wouldn't be the first school in our country for black children. That actually happened when Prudence Crandall in Connecticut was approached by the daughter of a freed slave and asked Prudence if she could please teach her. She said she absolutely would, but the parents of her white students were furious. Either Prudence would stop having a black child in the same classroom as their children, or they would yank their kids out of her school. Prudence said she'd do them all a big favor and immediately dismissed all of her white students permanently. Myrtilla knew she needed money to start her school. She wrote to the now famous abolitionist down the road in Peterborough, New York, named Garrett Smith, to ask for his support. Instead, she got a simple reply of, "It's a fool's errand." Garrett had one goal, and that was to end slavery immediately. Although he thought what she was doing was noble, giving slaves an education would take way too long to make a difference. But at this point, Myrtilla had gotten pretty good at telling the men she came across, "I'm going to do it anyway." She reached out to an even more famous abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, but when her letters to him went unanswered, she showed up to see him in person. He later said of that day that all he could picture was this frail woman pacing back and forth in front of him, excitedly explaining her plans, and "Wouldn't it be great, and what do you think?" But all he said was, "Don't do it. You'll get yourself killed, and it's not worth your life, no matter how noble I think it is." Of course, Myrtilla said she'd do it anyway. But the two remained lifelong friends, and he even spoke at her funeral years later. With some money to start her school, Myrtilla headed to Washington, D.C. in 1851, and there she convinced a man who was a freed slave himself to rent her a room of his house to be her classroom. By the end of the first month, she had 5 girls, her scholars, she called them. By the end of the second, she had 45. Not only did she insist that they would have the best education possible, but they would have impeccable manners, they would wear clean clothes, and they would brush their teeth every day. She brought in lecturers, she took them on field trips, and they wrote thousands of letters to benefactors for supplies and to congressmen to help end slavery, to get equal education laws for all students, and could women maybe get some rights too? All of this while being harassed in the streets and having bricks thrown through their windows. Eventually, the man she rented a room from had to ask her to leave because of threats to his life. as did the next man, and the next, and the next. Myrtilla desperately needed $4,000 to open her own school. The Quakers helped her immensely, but her biggest cheerleader was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And with $1,000 of Harriet's royalties from writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, Myrtilla finally had the money to build her school. An uninvited parade of onlookers came to the school on a regular basis and reported they'd never seen better behaved children in all their lives. When Myrtilla was gone, sometimes for weeks to raise money, the older girls would step in to teach the younger ones to keep the school open. But by 1860, Myrtilla was exhausted both mentally and physically. She became not the easiest person to get along with. Her teachers were quitting right and left, and her school was lit on fire but saved. She decided to close it, rent out the building, and head to California for a little R&R. While there, however, she and the driver of a lively team of horses were tossed 30 feet in the air from their carriage. She was alive but badly hurt and said, "You know what? I think I'm going to go home." She sailed through the Panama Canal and made it back to Washington, D.C., but died from her injuries 10 days later on December 17th, 1864, at the age of 49. The inscription on her headstone in Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown was written by a freed slave. "In this lowly grave, a conqueror lies." The Miner Building, named after the little girl from my hometown who tried to change the world, is part of the University of the District of Columbia and served as a teacher's college well into the 1950s. If you can do a good deed, or a noble and true one, do it. Care not for the opinion of the world. Myrtilla Miner.